My name is Deborah Schwartz, and I'm on the board of the Mill Valley Historical Society in charge of the First Wednesday Speaker Series and the Oral History Program. And tonight, I'm very, very pleased to have a most interesting talk about, I'm a mountain girl myself. I'm a hiker, and so I'm not too surfy, but I see from trails overlooking the bay evidence of shipwrecks, and I always wonder, well, apparently you guys do too, because you're all here on a day that I wouldn't have thought would be so convenient. So thanks so much. First, before we begin, I want to say thank you to the Mill Valley Public Library for allowing the Historical Society to host our speaker series. It's nice and fancy upstairs, but this is nice down here, and it's familiar in its community, and it's a nice place to be as the day settles. One of the ways that we show our appreciation for the use of this room, and many of you already know this, is that after the talk, you help us put the chairs back on the rack so the employees don't have to do so much. So thanks so much in advance for that. How many are members of the Historical Society here? Oh, nice. Well, do you like being members? Yeah. If you're a member for a very meager membership fee, I think it's probably less than a mojito or something like that at most of our restaurants. With that membership, for those of you that aren't members, you get alerts to First Wednesday Speakers Series talks. You'll hear about anything that we've got going on as fundraisers, our annual walk, so many wonderful things, and it just comes to your mailbox, a gentle reminder so you don't miss all the good stuff. So think about that. We have membership forms here. Here's a little bit about tonight's time schedule. Brian Crawford, that's our speaker tonight, talking about Shipwrecks of Marin. He'll be talking for about 50 minutes?
Yeah.
50 minutes or so. And after that, we'll have a Q&A for about 15 minutes. So I ask you to kindly hold any questions you have till then. And then after the Q&A is over, that's the time for you to look at books that Brian's selling, schmooze with your friends, and help us put the room in order. And so that's how it's going to go. San Francisco and Marin County have an invisibility cloak, as astonishing and amazing as anything from a Harry Potter book. And what is this cloak comprised of? Clouds of water droplets mostly. And it's our fog. The redwood trees love it. That's why they live here. But ancient mariners, not so much. They cursed it. It was dangerous, and we had funny, weird rocks in our bay and treacherous tides where fresh water meets ocean water, and it's just basically harrowing a good deal of the time if you were here in the 1800s or 1700s and all the way up to really more modern technology. So Brian has done a great job of researching and fleshing out the details of famous wrecks and identifying more than 100 wrecks not documented anywhere else. Brian is an author, a historian, an open space activist living in Marin County with his wife, Linda, and their son, Nathan. He was born in Ohio in 1947 and attended Ohio State and Antioch College, but dropped out and went to Haight-Ashbury for the Summer of Love, which is why he has that book about peyote over there.
Yeah.
After several years and many adventures on the road, he joined a group that brought a schooner in Nova Scotia, and he served as a second officer sailing it down the East Coast into a hurricane. Later, he went to Tonga in the South Pacific, where he met his wife, and he joined an Australian nuclear protest yacht bound to French Polynesia to anchor it at Ground Zero. Thank you very much. And the mission was aborted, and Crawford helped sail the yacht through Fiji and New Caledonia and down the coast of Australia, where he served as a navigator in the Sydney-Hobart yacht race. He volunteers as a researcher and an archivist at the Map of Annex in the California room at the Marin County Free Library. He has published 3 novels set in the South Pacific, the Confederacy, and the Middle Earth. That one I quite liked. 3 collections of short stories, 3 memoirs of his adventures, 4 books on local Marin history, and has reprinted annotated versions of 8 old out-of-print books. But what does he really know about shipwrecks? Personally, is it all historical research? I mean, it says here in the bio that it hints to something, but I was wondering about that today, so I called him up and said, have you a harrowing tale of your own to tell? And as a matter of fact, he does. Now, I've got it written down here, but I think I would invite you up to tell your own story.
Fortunately, it's in a book. This book's called Pirates, and it's not about pirates. It's about a group of hippies that in 1970 bought a 147-foot Grand Banks fishing schooner, that one, and sailed it down the East Coast. All went well for the first 10 minutes, and then we hit a storm. We're blown into Halifax, went out again, got hit by a big nor'easter. We were driven into Gloucester, spent the entire winter in Gloucester, which is a treat. And came out and headed down the coast. We were trying to get to Brownsville and ran into yet another storm that we came so near sinking. We took on so much water that the engine inhaled all this seawater, and that stops the engine. We had a spare, so we managed to limp into Norfolk and anchored, but then we were totally broke, and it's very hard to find parts for a 1937 5-cylinder engine. So the whole crew went back to California to try to earn more money to buy parts. And that left me and the chief engineer alone on the ship. But it was anchored in Hampton Roads. What can go wrong? Hurricane Agnes can go wrong. It came in on the summer solstice in 1972. It was the worst storm ever recorded in North America at the time. The winds weren't all that high. It was only 85. Sustained 85, which is enough when you're on a ship. But there was so much rain. It was the most rainfall ever reported in the United States. And it flooded vast areas of Virginia. And we were at anchor out in fairly shallow water in Hampton Roads. And all this, sheds and dead cows and cars and stuff were drifting past us. And we had 2 anchors down, a 450-pound Danforth and a 150-pound plow, which should be enough. But all this debris coming against us dragged us off the anchor. And since we couldn't start the engine, there was very little to do. So we drifted for 4 miles right into the Norfolk Navy Yards, where there's a whole line of aircraft carriers docked. And we drifted right up under the stern of the Iwo Jima, where they were actually throwing things down to us. We were that close, and spent the entire night like that. The Coast Guard couldn't get to us. They couldn't go out. And when it finally settled down in the morning, they did come out and they said, we can tow you out of here. And we said, well, we've got these 2 big anchors down. And as we came across, as we were sitting out there in the tide, we kept rotating every time the tide went around. So the 2 chains were braided together. So we couldn't raise either anchor. So they put a line on the stern and towed us around in circles, I think 17 times before it was untied. And then we managed to get the one engine going and got out and re-anchored. So the Coast Guard saved my life, and I really appreciate it. And you'll see that they were a big influence. They saved many lives here in Marin as well.
Well, I said in the introduction that we were glad to have him, but now it means so much more. We are very glad to have you.
Yes.
Ladies and gentlemen, give a warm welcome to Brian Crawford.
Welcome. Thank you for coming. So how did I get into this? Why am I up here? I'm one of those strange people that likes reading old newspapers. And there is a wonderful resource that the UC Riverside puts out called the California Digital Newspaper Collection, in which they have digitized 8 million pages of California newspapers, all the way from the very first one in 1846. It was published in Monterey, one page in English, one page in Spanish. I work as a historian and an archivist and a researcher. So I write articles for the Marine History Museum and for the California Room. So in researching one of my books, I came upon the wreck of a steamer, the Pacific steamship Pacific. And it was not a good, well-found boat. It might have been when it was new, but it was not new in 1875. And it was in Washington State. And in November 1875, they were just getting ready to come down south. They had picked up this large collection of passengers, many more than she was rated for. There were a lot of people. It was during the gold rush in British Columbia, and there were a whole lot of entertainers, an equestrian troupe, jugglers, singers, opera people, and like sensible people, they were leaving Canada in November. And so they crowded aboard until it was just packed. And just as they were leaving the dock, a whole crowd of gold miners showed up with their pokes of gold dust, and they wanted to ride south. And so they crammed aboard. And since they didn't have tickets, no one knows exactly how many people were aboard, but at least 500. And it went around the corner of Tatoosh Island, which is off Cape Flattery. It's that tip of Washington you go around when you come down south. Many of these people were socialites. There were a lot of people from Marin and a lot of people, well-known people in the Bay Area that were friends of Marinites. As they rounded Tatoosh Island, a clipper ship, you can just barely see it here, the Orpheus, struck them. And as later reports said, she couldn't have sunk faster if she'd been made of glass. She went down almost instantly. Most people probably never knew what was happening until they were underwater. 2 men, oddly enough, survived. After 3 days, one was found. After 4 days, the other was found. And they were the only survivors, but they told a remarkable story. So I researched this and wrote a book about it, also available for your reading pleasure. But it really hit Marin hard. Almost everybody here knew somebody on this ship. It was really the Titanic of the era. So I wanted, in the process of writing this book, I was reading the old newspapers, trying to find accounts of wrecks. And scanning for the word wreck in those days is a very productive exercise. And I started finding, nope, this one's in Marin. Nope, that's another wreck. No, that's another wreck. And I started realizing that there were really hundreds of wrecks in Marin County. And so as soon as I finished this book, I started on the next one. And that was to try to identify all the shipwrecks of Marin County. There are a number of wonderful resources. The Park Service has one, a list of shipwrecks. The Maritime Museum has one. The Congressional Record has a list. There's a book called Shipwrecks of the Golden Gate. There's one called Shipwrecks of the Pacific Coast. So I went through all those, collated all the lists together, eliminated the duplicates, and I came up with about, I think, 190 wrecks in Marin County. But I realized as I was going through the newspapers trying to find information on them that I was finding a lot more wrecks in the papers than were reported in any of these lists. And I found over 100 more. So this coast is really a graveyard of ships. I have 308 that I know of in Marin County, and of course there's nearly as many more on the south coast of the Golden Gate and along Ocean Beach. There are many, many on Land's End. So, but Point Reyes was a real hazard, sticking out into the fog there. Duxbury Reef was. Point Reyes has 94 known wrecks. Duxbury Reef has 54, I think, and many, many more all along the coast. So why were there so many wrecks here? Well, it's geography. Here's a sample of some of the wrecks. Of course, no pictures of the early ones. These are some of the ones from the late 19th and early 20th century. These are all on Point Reyes. So mainly we don't have a very hospitable coast for ships. There's no place to land from miles and miles of the coast. There's very few beaches. Anywhere you come ashore by mistake is a mistake. And the big thing, of course, is our beloved fog. If you're offshore, even a few hundred yards in that fog, you can't tell. You really don't know where the shore is until you are there. The very first European to ever lay eyes on Marin County, Francis Drake, commented on the fog in 1579. Hence come these thick mists and most stinking fogges, wherein a blind pilot is as good as the best director of a course. In the 440 years since, hundreds of captains have strained their eyes into the murk and muttered very similar thoughts. This is a map that just shows some of the wrecks on Point Reyes. And this is far from all of them. And you can see it's only for a little over 100 years. So I decided to write this book and call it Shipwrecks of Marin. And that required some definition. What's a ship? What's a wreck? And what's Marin? So using my overwhelming, sweeping authorial powers, I decided a ship is anything bigger than a dinghy, a skiff, a rowboat, a canoe. There's a number of stories of duck hunters shooting the bottom out of their skiffs. That didn't make the cut. Also, people that got in trouble but got out of it okay didn't make the cut. Many of these ships were not lost. They went aground and got off, or they were salvaged and raised and later repaired. So not every ship was lost, but they all came to grief on the shores of Marin County. And for the third definition, I used essentially the government definition, 3 miles offshore on the coast, coming down the county line out to the middle of San Pablo Bay, right through the middle of Red Rock, just skimming the outer edge of Angel Island, and then following very close to the shore at the Golden Gate. Almost all the water in the Golden Gate is in San Francisco County. So every time I found a wreck in the Golden Gate, I had to figure out which side it's on, where did it hit? If it hit Angel Island, is it on the east side or the west side? I had to stop somewhere. So that was my definition. With so many wrecks documented, I can only touch on a handful of the more important and dramatic ones today. And the first one is the earliest one, the San Agustin in 1595. It's the first recorded shipwreck in California. After Magellan discovered the Philippines in 1521, the Spanish encountered Chinese traders who made regular trips to Manila with their priceless silks, spices, and porcelain. New Spain produced vast amounts of silver from the Inca mines of Peru, and the Chinese would take all they could get. The Spanish developed a plan to fill a ship with silver at Acapulco and sail it to Manila. There they would buy all the Chinese goods they could cram into it, then return to Acapulco. From there the goods would be transshipped by mule train to Veracruz, where they would be loaded on other ships for the voyage across the Atlantic to Spain. The westward passage from Acapulco to Manila was relatively straightforward, as they could just ride the prevailing trade winds all the way. The return trip was the problem, because the winds between the two ports always blew to the west. There were a number of ships that tried that passage and never arrived because it took them too long. They ran out of food, water, or scurvy took them down. The man who solved the problem was Friar Andres de Urdaneta. He sailed north to the 38th parallel in 1565, off the coast of Japan before turning east. He found steady westerlies that carried him across the Pacific to the coast near Mendocino, then followed it south to Acapulco. A feasible trade route had finally been discovered. From that time on, 1 or 2 ships packed with silver, known as the Acapulco galleons, would sail from Acapulco each January, taking about 3 months to reach Manila around April. After loading with the richest Chinese goods, the ships, now called the Manila galleons, would sail in July, reaching Mexico about 4 months later in December. The annual voyage continued for exactly 250 years and made Spain the richest and most powerful nation in the world. Until this guy. In 1579, only 14 years after the establishment of the trade route, English privateer Francis Drake sailed around the Horn into the Pacific and took the treasure ship Cacafuego. capturing so much treasure it financed the British Treasury for decades, allowing them to build sufficient warships to fight off the Spanish Armada 9 years later. The Cacafuego is kind of a rude nickname. This is the actual name of it. And it carried, I think, 28 tons of silver and like half that amount of gold. It was a very rich treasure. After the capture of the ship, he headed up to California. This was not one of the treasure galleons, by the way. This was just bringing treasure up from Peru to Mexico. But he knew about the Manila galleon and figured that it would be a good place to head it off. So he headed up to California and laid around for a while waiting for it to show up. And when it didn't, decided that the best way home was to go home by way of China. But before he did that, he had to get his ship in shape. He'd been out for a very long time. The men were ill and grumpy, and the ship was very dirty on the bottom. So they reconnoitered along the coast until they discovered Point Reyes and tucked into the little bay just behind it, where they were sheltered from the prevailing winds, and they could careen the ship. This is a captured Spanish ship that he brought with him. He brought quite a number of Spanish prisoners with him, especially the pilots and navigators that he thought would be useful on the coast. So when they got here, they made friends with the Miwok. They established good relations with them. They built a little stockade out of stone on the shore and unloaded all the cannon and treasure and everything out of it, out of the ship, to lighten it enough that they could careen it and clean the bottom. Since he was going to be going home by way of China, he figured he didn't need to carry all that Chinese porcelain that he had taken from the Spanish, so he left it on the beach. Another thing he didn't need was about 30 of his crew. So he left his prisoners and a couple of dozen of his crew members, his mulatto girlfriend, and said, have a nice walk home, and left them there. There are rumors that when the Spanish came a couple hundred years later, they encountered Miwoks that had light hair and lighter skin than the others. So it's very possible that they were just absorbed into the tribe. The Italian pilot that he had captured from the Spanish walked to Monterey, Mexico, not Monterey, California. And so he walked the entire length of California. He was almost certainly the first white man to see San Francisco Bay. Drake then returned, was knighted, and nobody else came back for some years. But his attack shocked the Spanish. Captains of the galleons wanted protected harbors on the American coast where they could find shelter and repair and provision their ships while protected from the English. Since the coast of California was almost completely unknown, King Philip sent out an exploring expedition to chart the coast and look for suitable harbors. The man he chose for the job was Sebastian Cermeño, a 35-year-old Portuguese navigator of great abilities and experience. Cermeño sailed his own ship, the San Pedro, to Manila. The passage convinced him his ship was unsuitable for his mission, so he leased a sturdier galleon, the San Agustin, of about 80 feet and 200 tons. So 80 feet is not a very big vessel. He hired a crew of 80 of the best seamen he could find in Manila. They loaded 150 tons of cargo, mostly porcelain, gold, wax, and silk. They also carried a sturdy launch disassembled for stowage to assist in the survey of the American coast. Riding low in the water with her heavy cargo, the San Agustin left Manila on July 5th, 1595. After a hard voyage, they finally spotted land near Point Trinidad in Humboldt County. Cermeño's crew were exhausted and unhealthy, and everyone was concerned about the soundness of the ship. They started cruising slowly down the coast, looking for a protected harbor where they could refit and careen and do some hunting for the fresh food that they craved. Finally, they spotted a long, high ridge jutting out from the coast. Exploring cautiously around it, they found a sheltered bay in its lee. Cermeño ordered the anchor dropped in 7 fathoms of water where a stream ran down to the sea. There. This is Drake's Estero, Drake's Beach, Limantour Spit. It was November 7th, 1595, 4 months and 2 days out of Manila. The crew set to work on repairs. Friendly trading was established, and Cermeño noted that the coast Miwok seemed surprisingly unsurprised by the wonders of his European ship. Although he did not know it, he didn't learn it. This was probably because they were the very same people who had met Drake 16 years earlier. For 3 weeks, they repaired and resupplied the ship. They assembled the launch, essentially a very large dugout canoe built by the Filipino natives. Then in late November, a heavy gale struck, this time from the southwest. No longer protected by the high walls of Point Reyes, the San Agustin swung stern on to the beach and tugged viciously at her anchor. Cermeño and most of his men were ashore at the time and could only watch helplessly as the anchor pulled free and the galleon drove up onto the beach with massive seas washing across her decks. The few remaining men aboard fought for their lives, but several were drowned. Some accounts say 4, others 7, others 12. As the survivors looked on in horror, the ship was smashed to pieces, the precious cargo lost in the surf. When the storm finally passed, Cermeño gathered his men. Their only chance of reaching home, he told them, was for all 76 survivors to cram into the launch and try to sail more than 2,500 miles to Acapulco. They had saved a few bales of silk and some crates of porcelain, but there was, of course, no room to carry them. Cermeño had these buried on the beach to be picked up later. They loaded the few provisions and supplies they had salvaged into the launch and set off to the south, very low on food and very likely hope. They stopped occasionally to gather acorns and other native foods, but continued pressing on every day. 6 weeks later, they arrived in Acapulco. Cermeño had managed this tremendous open boat journey without losing a man, which puts it up there in the categories there with Bly's open boat journey and some of the amazing ones. He never returned to salvage the treasure or reclaim the cargo he had hidden. Both are still under the sand in Drake's Bay, in spite of several attempts to locate him. It is strange to think of the 40,000 miles of the Pacific coastline of North America, the first 2 vessels to Northern California, completely unknown to each other. Both left piles of Chinese porcelain within a few hundred yards of each other on the same stretch of Marin County beach. And some of it has been found, and most experts feel that these sharp-edged fragments that are not water-worn are probably Drake's, because he left his on the beach, and the Indians no doubt picked them up and used them and carried them around. And these ones that are water-worn are probably Cermeño's, because they came in through the surf. But it looks like he might have bought them at the same place, right? They're very similar, same little shop. 8 years after Cermeño left, another Spanish explorer, Sebastián Vizcaíno, sailed by the area and named it Punta de los Reyes. No one else visited for almost 2 centuries. Until 1841. The next account we have of a shipwreck was 246 years later. This was a small French schooner Ayacucho in October 1841. Now, I have no pictures of the Ayacucho, but this is a schooner built in the 1840s. It probably would have been very similar. This is a British one. And there's a great deal of confusion in the reference books because there was a second boat called the Ayacucho on the coast at the same time. Richard Henry Dana enthused about it in 2 years before the mast, about how beautiful it was. It was the fastest and best sailor he had ever seen. And so many historians feel that this wreck was that one, and it's clearly not. It was a French schooner. The other one was an English brig. The owner and supercargo was a 29-year-old Breton named Joseph-Yves Limantour. He had come to Veracruz in 1831, and by 1836 had established a trading business based in Mexico City. He purchased the Ayacucho and began trading between Valparaiso and California. The Mexican colonies in California were forbidden to trade with foreigners, so they were eager for manufactured goods. In October 1841, Limantour was bringing a load of valuable luxury goods from Mexico to San Francisco. Like many after him, in the fog, he mistook the looming bulk of Point Reyes for the Marin headlands and turned east into what he thought was the Golden Gate. Instead, the ship drove onto the sands on the eastern shore of Drake's Bay, not far from where the San Agustin had gone aground. I could do this whole talk just about 100 yards of beach there. The schooner was not badly damaged, and the crew managed to get ashore safely. Limantour set off on foot and walked to San Rafael and acquired a boat to San Francisco, still called Yerba Buena then, with a population of about 300. He arranged for his cargo to be brought to the town, where the local elite snapped up his exotic goods. The Ayacucho was written off as a total loss and eventually broke up in the surf. Limantour returned to Mexico City, a wealthy man. And that could have been the end of the story, but he came back to San Francisco 12 years later in 1853. Things had changed. By this time, California was an American state, and the gold rush had turned the village of Yerba Buena into the city of San Francisco with 250,000 residents. Limantour had with him a number of Mexican land grants signed by the governor of California in 1841, Manuel Mecatorena, granting several large tracts of land to Jose Limantour, as the Mexicans called him. The lands claimed were enormous, over 300 square miles, including Cape Mendocino, Tiburon, Alcatraz, the Farallones, much of Monterey, Tulare, and Lake counties, and all of the city of San Francisco. Call my attorney. And they did. So Limantour's claims were taken to court. Some experts initially judged that the grants and signatures were authentic, and he did own San Francisco. But after 4 years of legal battles, the federal court ruled that the grants were forgeries. Limantour was arrested for fraud, but ever resourceful, he posted bail and skipped town to Mexico City, where he died in 1885. All that remains of Limantour's supposed empire is the lovely beach that still bears his name. The next wreck is just 8 years later. It's another name that most of you will recognize. She left her name indelibly on Marin, though it barely qualifies as a shipwreck. She was built in Boston in 1833. She was only 109 feet long, though a full-rigged three-masted ship. She worked the Atlantic coast for her first 15 years, but then came the news of the gold strike in California, and hundreds of thousands of men suddenly wanted to get to California as quickly as possible. A group of 25 Harvard students and alumni decided to give up their careers and join the rush. They formed themselves into the Old Harvard Company. They raised the funds and bought the little Duxbury. They hired an experienced captain, 36-year-old William Cheever Varina. They put this ad in a newspaper to try to attract paying passengers, especially, especially ladies. They have a cabin fitted up, so those fraternity boys, no ladies took them up on the offer, and so they sailed on their own. The fare of $125 is equivalent to about $4,000 today, so it was a significant investment. In the middle of a New England winter, they set out into the Atlantic on February 9th, 1849. They knew they had many months of travel before them. The fastest ships took well over 100 days to reach California, and the Duxbury was anything but fast. But the boys were young and enthusiastic and fun-loving, and they threw themselves into the work of driving the ship south. They made up games and sports and played practical jokes on each other. One wag started a ship's newspaper called The Petrel, full of jokes and anecdotes at the expense of one boy or another. And it's online. It's an interesting read. On August 21st, as they were approaching their destination, they encountered thick fog near the coast. Captain Varina thought that they were entering the Golden Gate, but then there was a jolting halt. The Duxbury was too far north and had struck the reef at the mouth of Bolinas Bay that now bears her name. And you can see why you wouldn't want to take a shortcut across that. Fortunately, the damage was slight, and the passengers and crew pulled the ship off the reef with her own boats and backed into open water. The next day, they arrived in San Francisco, sold the ship, and headed for the gold fields. One of the members of the company was a dentist, Dr. Galen Burdell, who later founded the town of Point Reyes Station and who owned Rancho Olimpali. Mount Burdell in Nevada is named for him. The next wreck is another familiar name. Excuse me. The Tennessee was a fine first-class vessel. Built in New York in 1848 and intended for the run between New York and Savannah. She was a 211-foot wooden sidewheel steamer of 1,200 tons. But the news of the discovery of gold in California abruptly changed her career, as it did those of so many ships and people around the world. She was purchased by the Pacific Mail Steamship Company and refit to carry an additional 350 steerage passengers. In 1849, she steamed through the Straits of Magellan and up to Panama, arriving in March 1850. The Tennessee was the first large ship to arrive there after the news of the gold strike swept around the world. 3,000 would-be passengers met her at the dock and clamored for passage to San Francisco. She took on as many as could be crammed aboard and sailed to San Francisco, where the eager prospectors fanned out for the diggings. She was assigned to Captain Edward Mellis and put on the regular run between Panama and San Francisco, bringing more miners to San Francisco as fast as she could go. On Saturday, March 5th, 1853, Captain Mellis obtained a sighting that indicated that they were about 100 miles from the Golden Gate. Around dusk, she entered a thick bank of fog, and he reduced his speed and stationed lookouts forward to give warning of land. At 1 a.m. on Sunday morning, March 6th, a lookout shouted that he saw a high rock ahead to starboard. Captain Mellis guessed it was Mile Rock on the southern side of the Golden Gate and steered accordingly. Soon afterwards, land was seen close on the starboard side, which was taken to be Point Lobos. More assured now, Mellis increased his steam, but suddenly a sandy beach appeared directly ahead. Captain Mellis reversed the engines, but at the same time a ledge of rocks was seen immediately astern. Unable to go either forward or back, he tried to turn her in her own length by repeatedly reversing, but without any momentum, the seas began to take control of her. The stern struck the sand with an impact that threw the dishes from the tables. The confusion and excitement when she first struck was great, but order was promptly restored. The sea then swung her around, and she went broadside onto the beach. As soon as she went on the ground, Mr. Dowling, the chief mate, jumped overboard and swam to shore with a line by which to haul a hawser ashore. Although exhausted, he immediately returned to the ship to resume his duties. It was now 9:30 on Sunday morning. It was soon discovered that she lay in Potato Cove, since known as Tennessee Cove, 4 miles north of her intended destination. In a way, she was lucky. They had struck the only sandy beach in miles. Also, the sea was quite calm, and the ship rested fairly comfortably on a level bed of sand. A quick inspection showed that she was still perfectly tight. The passengers, mail, baggage, and provisions were all safely landed from the ship within 4 hours, and there was every expectation of getting her off with little damage. The crew brought the sails ashore and erected makeshift tents for the passengers, complete with beds and bedding. Some of the officers led a party of 100 passengers, including 4 ladies, overland to Sausalito to get help. They straggled into town in the afternoon. Wires were sent to the ship's agents in San Francisco, and the steamer Confidence was dispatched to Sausalito to pick up the hikers. The steam tug Goliath, Captain Totten, was hired to go out to the site of the wreck. When she arrived, they found the seas had turned the big ship's head to the shore, embedded 2 feet deep in the sand. It was late in the evening, and Goliath anchored close by for the night to wait for the morning. But during Monday night, the rollers came in heavily on the beach, lifting the ship up from 4 to 5 feet and thumping her heavily onto the sand as they ran back. By Tuesday morning, she broke up and turned into a complete wreck. The Tennessee gradually broke up. The pieces drifted away over the following months. Her engines and machinery remain visible for many years. Today, they lie beneath the sands of Tennessee Beach, right in here at this end of the beach. And when the winter storms take the sand out, you can still see them, and children climb on the massive rusted iron of her boilers and engines. So far, these stories aren't too sad. I mean, you don't go to a talk like this and expect a happy ending, right? I mean, nobody was surprised by how the Titanic movie ended. So there are some sad stories here. And this is one of them, the Haddingtonshire. In one of the worst wrecks in Marin. She was a British iron bark, 215 feet long. Again, this is not her, but a very similar vessel, although it is French. But she must have looked much like this. A bark has square sails on the forward mast and fore and aft sails on the mizzen mast. And so she was 215 feet long, fairly large ship. She was under the command of Captain John Fraser of Inverness, Scotland. It was his very first command. The crew consisted of 21 hand-picked young men and boys, most from Glasgow. Her maiden voyage was to the Columbia River in Oregon. There they loaded more than 17,000 cases of canned salmon and 12,000 barrels of flour, worth over $100,000. On the 4th of July, 1885, she left Astoria, bound for home. Captain Fraser wished to impress his owners with a quick trip, so he carried as much sail as possible. As they approached the equator on the 25th of July, they were struck by a sudden severe cyclone that knocked the bark flat with her mast down in the water. After 2 terrifying hours, she slowly righted, water pouring off her decks. When they called the roll of the crew, they found 4 men missing, including the carpenter, who they were going to need a lot. 1 lifeboat was gone, the rigging was wrecked, and the chronometer and both sextants had been lost. Unable to navigate, the captain was forced to turn back to San Francisco for repairs. They began beating back north by dead reckoning alone, making repairs as they could and pumping day and night. It took them 6 long weeks, but finally they figured that they were approaching the Golden Gate on Wednesday, August 19th. As was the captain's wont, she had all sails set. The courses, lower topsails, upper topsails to gallants and royals, so it had the pedal to the metal. The weather was clear and there was a bright moon, but near midnight a thick fog set in. One of the men, a Norwegian named Hans Murkison, on coming off lookout at midnight, reported that he had noticed a change in the color of the water, and he believed that they must be close to shore. The captain paid no attention to Murkison's fears, but he ordered the foghorn to be sounded every minute. The wind was rising, threatening a storm. The captain ordered the royals sent down, as the top ones, which is like slowing down to 70, and ordered more lookouts out. He then retired to his cabin, leaving the bark in the hands of his first mate, Mr. Cunningham. At 2 a.m. Thursday morning, one of the apprentices, 16-year-old Willie Murray, was heaving the log to gauge their speed. He reported to the mate that they were making 8 knots. At that moment, the lookout on the forecastle cried out, "Land ahead!" Mr. Cunningham peered forward and thought he saw a light flash out briefly from somewhere high above. He shouted for the captain and called all hands to reduce sail, but the Haddingtonshire drove onto a sandy beach at full speed. The bark heeled steeply to starboard and began pounding violently on the sand. Big waves immediately swept completely across the deck. And again, I don't have any photographs of this, but it must have looked much like this. Here are 2 other barks in similar straits. They clung there until about 3:30 in the morning, when the violent motion in the waves started to carry away parts of the rigging. Seeing that the mast could not stand much longer, the captain ordered the men... Captain Fraser rushed out of his cabin, took one look at his half-submerged ship, and ordered all hands into the one remaining lifeboat to abandon ship. But as it was being lowered, a huge wave smashed it against the side of the ship, shattering it into splinters. With no means of escape and the seas continuing to sweep across the deck, Captain Fraser ordered the men to climb into the rigging to get above the waves. Murray and 12 other men and boys scrambled up into the main rigging. That would be here. And Murkison and the steward climbed into the mizzen rigging. The captain and first mate went to below to fetch signal rockets and flares called blue lights. Coming up the companionway into the maelstrom on deck, the captain was knocked down by a wave and the rockets were swept from his hands. He managed to light one of the flares, then he and the mate climbed up into the mizzen rigging. They had to climb up to the topmast rigging, that's the top here. So the waves were that high across the deck. They clung there until about 3:30 in the morning, when the violent motion in the waves started to carry away parts of the rigging. Seeing that the mast could not stand much longer, the captain ordered the men back to the deck. Hans Murkison tried to climb down the rigging, but the steward was beneath him and seemed frozen in fear. The Norwegian grabbed a backstay and slid down to the deck. Just as he did, the mainmast collapsed over the side, pulling the mizzen down with it. Everyone was thrown into the water. Murkison was washed into the sea with the captain and steward. He was the strongest swimmer and tried to lead the other men toward the shore, but the waves were tossing around many crates of salmon, and the 3 men soon became separated. Murkison was caught by a huge breaker and thrown high up onto the beach. He was slammed down onto the sand so hard that it knocked him unconscious. After the mast came down, young Willie Murray found himself on deck, tangled in the broken rigging. He crawled up out of the wreckage, but an instant later, a wave swept him overboard into the icy sea. He could hear men screaming and crying for help, but it was so dark he could see nothing. All the events of his life passed before his eyes, and especially the faces of his family and images of his home in Scotland. Terrified and exhausted, he gave up hope and resolved to breathe in water and drown to end his misery. He sank, and the water closed over his head. But almost immediately, his toes touched sand. Regaining hope, he pushed off the bottom and resumed his struggle, though the surf dragged him back out again and again. He was slammed down hard on the sand and twisted his ankle painfully. He leaped up and hobbled up the beach out of reach of the waves. Then he collapsed in a faint. When he awoke, he guessed that several hours had passed. He sat up and looked around. He had no idea where he was. It was still very foggy, but there was the faintest hint of dawn. He was soaked and shivering in the icy wind. He couldn't see the ship or any of the crew, just a long, straight beach running off into the darkness in both directions. He called, but received no response. His ankle was very swollen and painful. He struggled up the beach to a line of scrubby sand dunes, then made his way along them until at last he came upon a path. He followed it inland until he caught the familiar sound of cows lowing. Then some buildings loomed up out of the dark. He went to the nearest one and banged on the door. He kept banging until he saw a light moving inside. A man opened the door and Willie collapsed into his arms. "Ship," he gasped. "On the beach. Need help." The man sat the exhausted boy at his kitchen table and called for his wife, who came down and started fixing a cup of tea. Willie was soaked and covered in sand and weed. They toweled him down and wrapped him in a warm blanket. The rancher poured a large splash of rum into the boy's tea before handing it to him. They were here. So here's the Point Reyes Light and Chimney Rock. So they were just up here on South Beach. And the Alphabet Ranches, the old B Ranch here, was then owned or leased by Reinhold. The rancher explained that he was named Peter Reinhold. His wife was Johanna. They ran a dairy ranch in the remote windswept lands behind South Beach on Point Reyes. Willie said that there were probably other survivors still on the beach. Peter went out to wake up the ranch hands. Willie was cleaned up and given warm, dry clothes and a hearty breakfast. Peter came back in to say that they were leaving for the beach. Willie's ankle was so sore that he couldn't go with them. Peter and his men got their horses and rode down to the beach, arriving just as day broke. 100 yards offshore were the twisted black remains of a large ship. Her masts were down, waves were breaking over her, and she seemed about to break up. There was no sign of anyone on the wreck or on the beach. They shouted and waved their lanterns, but got no reply. The men split up, heading each way to search for survivors or bodies. One party soon came upon the body of a man lying face down on the sand. As they gathered around, reluctant at first to touch the body and whispering among themselves, the apparent corpse raised its head and looked at them as startled as they. He told them that his name was Hans Murkison, able seaman. He had left the ship with several other men and thought that they had probably reached the shore safely. While the men continued their search for other survivors, Peter Reinhold offered the seaman his horse to ride to the house. Like many sailors, the Norwegian was unaccustomed to riding. He looked askance at the horse. "If it's all the same to you, sir," he said, "I'll walk." Accompanied by one of the men, he trudged off through the deep sand toward the house. No other survivors were ever found. A week after the wreck, a man named Owen Smith found a body tangled into kelp along the tide line. And this was up here closer to Pierce Point, probably near McClure's Beach, I believe. He covered it with a tarpaulin and walked 25 miles to Olima to call the county coroner, Edward Eden, in San Rafael. Eden and a reporter drove his hearse to the Olima Hotel, where they met the British consul, George Stanley, and the young apprentice, Willie Murray, who had traveled there to meet him, who told them the story of the voyage and wreck. They then left to go see the body that had been recovered. The wind was brisk and cold on the beach. They gathered around, and Coroner Eden pulled back the cover to reveal the body of a boy. His clothes were filled with sand, his hair tangled with seaweed, and his face sunburned. His eyes were open and bright, but he appeared just to be asleep. Willie burst into tears at the sight and said that the boy was his friend and fellow apprentice, Frederick Popham. He was taken to Olima and buried in the Olima Cemetery. Here is the burial record. Buried in Potter's Field, which usually means the poor section where there are no gravestones. So I have searched diligently and I can find no sign of the grave. But there were 100 people showed up. They piled flowers on the grave. And the British consul, Stanley, said, if an American ship ever wrecks on the shores of Great Britain, you can rest assured that we will treat your people just as well. He was quite moved by it. When it was all over, Stanley asked Willie and Hans their plans for the future. Both said that they had had more than enough of the maritime life, thank you very much, and intended to stay ashore from then on. One of the Reinhold daughters said, he's going to stay with us for a few months till he's better. Stanley offered to let the men's families know that they were safe. Willie explained that he was an orphan, but that he and his brother and 2 sisters lived with their aunt and uncle in Glasgow. "Well, this will be happy news to them," ventured the consul. "No, sir," the boy answered, tears springing to his eyes. "My cousin, their son, was lost with the ship." The next wreck is more recent. We're now in the 20th century. This sad shipwreck occurred not on the coast, but here in San Pablo Bay. It was a scow schooner. I don't know how many of you have seen the Alma that's at the Maritime Museum. You still see it sailing around on the bay. They are not trim, seaworthy looking crafts. They have a square bow. They're basically a barge with masts. And that's what they were. They carried rock, railroad iron, hay, dirt, whatever needed to be carried. And the mast, the boom on the mast could be raised up. As you can see here, they put a lot of hay on these boats. And so there's the fore boom, here's the main boom, and the helmsman stood on the hay, and he had ropes tied around the wheel. So he would steer from up there on top of the hay because you couldn't see from anywhere else. There were hundreds and hundreds of these scow schooners on the bay for a long time, well into the 20th century. They were still operating in the 20s. They were basically the work trucks of the day. One of the most remarkable of these working schooners was the Mystery, operated by Damian Espinosa de los Monteros and his family. Espinosa was born in Mexico around 1845 and came to San Francisco in 1860. As a young man, he worked on the rancho of John Reed at Tiburon. He must have been quite a character and was well known both where he lived in Petaluma and on the San Francisco waterfront. He was described in a newspaper article as a grim old Spanish captain of picturesque appearance. He was productive. His first wife gave him 22 children before she died, probably gratefully. And so he remarried, and his second wife gave him 11 more. They bought an old scow schooner and named it the Mystery. But Espinosa was too poor to pay a crew. Well, with 33 children, I can imagine. His wife served as cook, and his children helped out with the heavy labor of loading, unloading, and sailing. By 1907, he was quite old. His older sons had all moved away, so he put his girls to work. The eldest, Isabella, was 19. The next, Anita, 16. Jesusita, known as Rose, was 15. Grace, 13. And Clara, 11. Having an all-girl crew was unknown in those days, and the schooner Mystery became famous all over the state. Articles about the vessel appeared in newspapers as far away as Los Angeles. On Wednesday, March 20th, 1907, the Espinosas had a contract to deliver a load of crushed rock from the Petaluma quarry to San Francisco to rebuild the docks that were destroyed in the earthquake. The family worked all day to load the heavy, dusty cargo in time to catch the high tide in the river, which would occur near midnight. But the weather was bad and getting worse. The old seamen loitering on the docks predicted a storm. There must have been a family council, with grim old Damien arguing strongly for continuing. The mother, pregnant yet again, refused to go and said she wouldn't risk her little ones on the bay in that weather. In the end, only the three oldest girls, Isabella, Anita, and Rose, agreed to accompany him. So at midnight, in a driving rain and gusting wind, the girls cast off the lines and raised the schooner's three sails. They bellied out with cracks like whips, and the old Mystery moved sluggishly away from the dock under her heavy load. Now, it's not an easy run down to the bay from Petaluma. As you can see, the river winds through flats here. There's a lot of bends, and the wind was from the southeast, so it was blowing right in their faces. And the river is not very wide, and it has mud banks coming down on both sides. So they were sailing in pitch darkness and a pouring rain and probably had to tack every minute or two, trying to feel their way down the river. It took them 2 days to get to Black Point. They put in there, they had a friend who lived at Black Point, and they spent the day with him and had a barbecue. And the tide again turned around late in the evening. And so they set out again against recommendations, set into a driving wind and still raining. I just found another photograph of an old schooner under sail. The Mystery also had a skiff towing behind it like this, which was later found in Petaluma. Apparently it drifted all the way back up the river. They got out into San Pablo Bay and were heading directly into the wind. It rose to a howling blast. They could make little headway against it. There are very few places to seek shelter in San Pablo Bay. Their best choice was to take shelter on the north side of the long rocky peninsula of McNear's Point, thrusting out from the western shore with its quarries and brickyard on the tip. Most likely they would have tried to make their way there to take shelter beneath the high banks of McNear's Beach. So I think that this was probably what they were trying to do, and the southeasterly wind kept carrying them to the west into the shallows there of San Pablo Bay. We don't know what happened. We don't know if they tried to anchor or if they tried to heave to. But on Saturday morning, a capsized boat was spotted on her beam ends just offshore from St. Vincent's orphanage. It was not until 5 o'clock that evening, when the sea had calmed down somewhat, that anyone could get out and reach the boat. There was no sign of life. They probed the interior with a boat hook and encountered something soft they thought might be a body, but could extract nothing but a few articles of girls' clothing. In my book, I go in considerably more detail about this story and these people. But the mother came down from Petaluma and talked to the coroner and met the sheriff, and she kept trying to get people to go out and search for her family. But it took a long time. It was 11 days before Isabella was spotted floating just off Sausalito by a Coast Guard man. A few hours later, Rose was found in Alameda. The next day, Damien was recovered at Paradise Key. And it was 3 more weeks before Anita was found by a fisherman near Ashby Avenue in Berkeley. They were all buried at Calvary Catholic Cemetery in Petaluma. And again, I can't find the grave. So after that cheerful little tale, we turn to another cheerful little tale, the Hanalei. Perhaps the most poignant and tragic wreck on our coast is that of the steamer Hanalei in 1914. She was a wooden-hulled steam schooner, 175 feet long. In 1906, she was put on the run between San Francisco and Los Angeles. She was so popular with Los Angeles college students attending the northern colleges that she became known as the university boat. Jack London sailed in her to gather material and inspiration for his books. In 1913, she began ferrying lumber and passengers between Eureka and San Francisco. On Sunday, November 22, 1914, the Hanalei left Eureka for San Francisco with a full load of shingles and railroad ties. She also carried 35 passengers. Many headed home for Thanksgiving later that week. Excuse me. She had a crew of 31, commanded by Captain John Carey. A heavy fog came in during the night, and visibility was reduced to near zero. About 10:30 Monday morning, Captain Carey got a good sight through the fog on the rocky bluff of Point Reyes. He estimated that he was 3 miles off the point. He told his second mate, William C. Reese, that they would steer a course to clear Duxbury Reef, then head for the entrance to the Golden Gate. At 11:30, he retired to his cabin, leaving Reese in charge. At 11:45, he went below to have lunch. At 11:50, the lookout on the bow suddenly sang out, "Breakers ahead!" First Officer Thomas Scotty McTeague was washing up in his cabin when he heard the call. He rushed to the bridge, but before he got there, the Hanalei was on the rocks. McTeague reached the bridge and found Reese staring dumbly at the cliff only 40 yards away. I thought I heard the Duxbury Reef whistling buoy, and I hauled the ship in," said Reese. McTeague turned to the radioman, Lauren Lovejoy. "Send out an SOS at once." Lovejoy went into the radio shack and began hammering out the Morse code. Captain Carey rushed onto the bridge. "It was my fault, Captain," said Reese. "I turned too soon." Carey peered up at the 200-foot cliff still looming over the bow. He could see at once that they were stuck fast, but he thought that since they were so close to shore that they would be rescued fairly easily. Frightened passengers were already pouring out onto the deck. Women were screaming, and every time the ship slammed down on the rocks, there were more cries and shouts. Captain Carey went out on the wing bridge and called down to the throng of passengers milling around on the foredeck. "Everyone, please keep calm. As you see, we have run aground, but we know exactly where we are. That's the Marconi wireless station at Bolinas, right up there at the top of the cliff. There will be people coming to help." And just because we're going to be talking about the ship, this is the foredeck. These are the passenger cabins here. It's the engine spaces. This is called the hurricane deck, just because it was so breezy up there where the boats were stored. This is the wheelhouse and the radio shack. You can see it had masts, but they weren't really used for sailing in those days. They were more or less traditional. They were used for loading cargo. So keeping that in mind, there's the Marconi station about that time, and it's just, it's still there. You might have been there. You can look right down over the cliffs there onto the beach. People began to gather on the top of the bluff. They could look right down onto the deck of the Hanalei and talk to the people, but there was no possibility of climbing down the cliff to help. Between the blasts of the whistle, they shouted down to the ship that the lifesavers had been called from Point Bonita and Fort Point. The SOS was heard by several vessels, and by the end of the day, no fewer than 12 vessels were standing by just offshore. The problem was that the Hanalei had grounded so close to the shore that there were rocks all around her on all sides, preventing boats from approaching. At the same time, the pounding waves made it impossible to get to the wreck from shore. Several hundred people came out from Bolinas and gathered on the beach closest to the wreck, but there seemed to be no way to help. 2 lifeboats drifted ashore, but both were swamped and empty. It was learned later that 4 men had made it back to the steamer when they capsized, and 1 was drowned. At 2:30 that afternoon, First Mate Scotty McTeague set up the Lyle gun on the hurricane deck. Lyle gun's just a small cannon that can shoot a projectile with a trailing line. And once that line is secured at both ends, you can use it to haul a hawser across. And then you can use what's called a breeches buoy, which is like a life ring with baggy pants sewn in it. And you can get into those pants, and then that can be pulled along the hawser to shore. It was very effective. It's still in use. So all you need to do is get a line ashore. So McTeague set this up, pointed it up at the top of the cliff, and pulled the lanyard. The barrel of the little cannon exploded, and the projectile struck McTeague in the belly, sending him flying across the deck and breaking his ribs. The Hanalei settled deeper between the rocks, and waves started to come across the deck. The passengers and crew huddled up on the raised hurricane deck. Later that in the afternoon, a motor lifeboat arrived from the Point Bonita life-saving station. They tried several times to approach close enough to take off passengers, but each time the waves threw them back. Around 4 in the afternoon, there was a violent grinding crash, and screams came from the wreck. The Hanalei's keel had snapped in 2. The stern swung around almost at right angles to the bow. Just before sunset, a second life-saving boat arrived from the Fort Point life-saving station. They too failed to reach the wreck. Captain Carey launched the last remaining lifeboat, trailing a line to the Hanalei. It contained 4 of the crew and 1 passenger. For a moment, it rode the waves, but then it capsized in the breaking surf, and the line snapped. 3 men clung to the boat and were saved when it washed ashore. The 4th man grabbed onto the line and was pulled back aboard the Hanalei. The 5th man was drowned. As the ship continued to break up, the people were pressed farther back into the stern. Captain Carey sent the 10 women and 3 children, including a baby, to the top of the deck house, the highest point of the ship, where they clung to the rigging of the mast. Since they had lost power, radio operator Lovejoy climbed up there with them and used a flashlight to signal the shore. Someone from the Marconi station drove a car out to the edge of the cliff. By covering one of the headlights, he could reply to Lovejoy's messages. And just as this book was going to press, I stumbled upon a Popular Mechanics magazine that had an article on this rescue, and they did these wonderful pen and ink sketches. The people on the beach built bonfires to light the scene and provide some cheer to the desperate people on the wreck. The government vessels offshore turned their powerful searchlights on the wreck, casting the scene into glaring chiaroscuro. There was a brief break in the fog, and the people on the beach and atop the cliff could clearly make out the people on the wreck, one solid mass of squirming bodies clinging to whatever they could grasp as the waves swirled around them. The fog soon closed around them again. The San Francisco Examiner arranged to send a larger mortar gun and the crew of the Golden Gate life-saving station to the scene of the wreck. The crew and gun were shipped to Sausalito. A truck met the lifesavers at Sausalito and began the long journey to the site of the wreck. The Fort Point lifesavers decided to make one more desperate attempt to reach the wreck. Just as they had nearly touched the side of the ship, a wave caught the boat and capsized it. Captain Clark was thrown 40 feet right over the breaking surf. He shouted instructions to his men to try to right the boat and continue the rescue, but he was swept away. He reached the shore after more than 2 hours' battle in the waves. It was assumed that the other 5 men had drowned, but 4 of them were pulled aboard the wreck. At 5:45 in the evening, Elwood Schwerin, a UC student from Berkeley, volunteered to try to swim a line ashore. He tied a line around his waist and threw himself into the waves. He swam toward the roaring bonfires on the beach, but again and again he was pulled under and nearly drowned. With an almost superhuman effort, he managed to reach the shore and was pulled up onto the beach in a fainting condition. His first words were, "Did you get the line?" But in his struggle in the waves, the line must have slipped off, for it was no longer attached to his waist. He collapsed, and the lifesavers had to revive him. 3 other passengers tried to swim ashore. Only 1 survived, and he was pulled from the water unconscious. The Point Bonito lifesavers landed on the beach and set up their own Lyle gun. Around 11 that evening, they fired a line toward the wreck. The first line fell short. They loaded their second charge, and this time the line bounced off the side of the vessel before anyone could grab it. They only had the 2 charges and could do nothing more. At midnight, the watchers on the shore heard singing. It was the people on the Hanalei singing hymns to keep up their courage. They sang throughout the night, periodically interrupted when the wreck gave a lurch or a wave swept over them. At 2:30 a.m., a truck slid to a stop at the top of the bluff. It was the Examiner's newspaper truck with the crew from the Golden Gate Life-Saving Station and the big 150-pound Lyle gun. The news was flashed to Lovejoy, and cheers could be heard from the ship. A battery-powered searchlight had been set up on the bluff, its beam illuminating the wreck. But the attempt was complicated by the fact that the wreck was rapidly breaking up. Only the aftermost section remained above water, black with struggling figures, but it was only a few yards square. Captain Nelson fired the line toward the ship, but it fell wide. The men tried to reel the line back in for another try. Each time, Lovejoy flashed back how to correct the aim. Again and again, the line shot out, but never close enough for the people to reach it. At 4:40 in the morning, after more than 16 hours on the rocks, it was clear the hull could not stand much more. Waves covered the deck, and the people on the cabin top were sometimes hidden in flying spray. Those watching helplessly from the shore could clearly hear the people on the ship singing, "Nearer, my God, to thee." Suddenly, the lovely old hymn was broken off by a loud, grinding groan of wood and a howl of despair. Lovejoy flashed the message, "The Hanalei is breaking up. We are taking to the water. May God save us." The cutter McCulloch was close enough that they could say, they quote, "We saw the wooden timbers of the doomed vessel bulge open, close, open again, and then burst like a watermelon struck with a sledge," unquote. Nearly 60 people were thrown into the water. Illuminated by searchlights and watched by hundreds of horrified people, the struggling mass of bodies was swamped by waves and thrown against the jagged rocks. The ship's fuel tanks burst, covering the sea with a thick, viscous layer of oil that hindered swimmers and got into their gaping mouths and nostrils. The pilot house broke free, carrying 10 women, 3 children, and the 2 radio operators toward the shore. People on the beach linked arms and waded out into the icy water, forming a human chain to try to reach them. But a large timber slammed into the wreckage, throwing most of the people into the water. Another large portion of the wreck floated toward shore with 20 people clinging to it. When it was 100 yards offshore, someone managed to shoot a line aboard and people tailed on to haul them in. But a spar projecting from the wreckage caught on a submerged rock and caused it to capsize. The water was dotted with struggling swimmers and floating bodies. The wreckage was washed up onto the beach, and the lifesavers waded out and rescued 6 men still clinging to it, including Captain Carey and First Mate McTeague. And again, the Popular Mechanics article has an actual photograph of that. Other lifesavers and citizens ventured out into the water, into the waves again and again to try to reach people still struggling in the water. Boats from the government ships also nosed about as close to the rocks as they dared, picking up both survivors and bodies. And many of these were taken aboard the Coast Guard cutter McCulloch, which steamed back into San Francisco and was met at the dock. And the dock was lined with 2 lines of vehicles, with ambulances on one side and hearses on the other. And as the people were carried ashore on stretchers, a reporter ran along beside one of them, and there was a woman on the stretcher, Mrs. Goldfinger, and she gave this account of her experience. "We all gathered in the stern, which was high in the air, although the spray broke over us and we were all soon drenched and cold. The noise of the breakers mingled with the cry of the little Franz baby. Mrs. Franz was awfully brave and tried to quiet the baby. When it grew dark, it was worse. It began to look then as though we wouldn't be rescued at all. We could see fires lighted on the beach and also the flash of the gun as the life crew tried time and again to shoot a line to us from the beach, but it always seemed to fall short. I think all of the women and even some of the men cried when the lines fell short. The shore looked so near, and yet we were barred from it by the impassable barrier of rocks and angry waves, which even then were tearing the ship to pieces. I became so cold I was numb, probably mentally as well as physically. Fear of death seemed to leave me, and I watched the efforts of some of the men to swim ashore with lines and even cheered them. Later in the night, when it was pitch dark and the waves were breaking all over us, the cabin house on which I, with some 14 others, was clinging, broke away. It was lifted bodily off the ship, and the next minute we were all afloat on this frail piece of wreckage. I must have screamed with fright. There we were, adrift on this wreckage, and we could dimly see the dark outline of the ship as it pounded on the rocks, nearly covered with the flying spray, and to see men who still clung there. Then our piece of wreckage bumped on a rock, and a great wave broke clear over us, sweeping us off to one side, although we were all holding on for dear life. Mrs. Franz gave a scream, and I saw the wave tear a baby right from her arms. She must have fainted after that, for she sank down, and I thought she was dead. And then I saw the little babe floating away on the crest of a great wave, and it vanished in the night. Oh, it made my heart sick even to think of it. We were helpless and expecting to go to our death any moment. Just then our wreckage hit a rock with terrible force and broke into what seemed to be 1,000 pieces. We were all flung in all directions, and I seemed to go clear down to the bottom of the ocean before I finally came to the surface, nearly drowning and crying for help. There were cries all about me from men and women. Then a big piece of wood bumped into me, and I grasped it. I flung my arms around it and found it was a railroad tie. I hung on for all I could, and it seemed as though the sea was trying to tear me away from it. They tell me that I clung to the tie for 2 hours in that icy water, buffeted by the foaming waves. My only thought was to hang on. After what seemed hours, I was rescued by the McCulloch. I can still hear the shrieks and screams of those who went down, and I am so numbed by the terrible experience that I can scarcely realize I have been saved. The horror of it will remain with me till I die. This is how it looked in the morning. You can see the hurricane deck here. Here's the radio shack. There's parts of the hull, just wreckage all along here. Of the 35 passengers aboard the Hanalei, 20 were rescued and 15 died. Of the crew, 26 were rescued and 5 died, including Second Officer Reese, who had caused it all. 3 lifesavers died as well. Before I conclude, I want to honor the men of the United States Life-Saving Service. Founded in 1848, the service established stations in the fog-shrouded waters around San Francisco. Golden Gate Park in 1877, Fort Point in 1899, Point Reyes in 1890, Point Bonita in 1899, and Bolinas finally in 1915. That same year, the service was merged with the United States Revenue Service to create the Coast Guard. These men went out in the most appalling conditions, in many cases giving their lives to save others. My book is full of their brave deeds. Were it not for the vigilance and courage of these men, the toll of the dead would be far higher than the 200 people known to have died on Marin Coast. So these are the stories of 7 of the shipwrecks of Marin. The book has details on these and 300 more. I'd be happy to take your questions.
Wow. Okay, well, speechless here. That was quite a presentation.
Thank you.
If you would be so kind, when people ask the question, to repeat it
All right.
to the microphone.
Well, I have one.
Okay. Any
Questions? Oh, that makes it easy. Oh, there's one. Yes, he's asking if the masts were used. There was a long transition from sail to power, and of course, at first, the engines were auxiliary, and then when they became powerful enough that you could actually cross an ocean with them, the masts and sails were retained in case of emergency. They could be used to steady the ship, to keep it from rolling so much. And of course, if the engine went out, you could use them. But by the time of the Hanalei, by the 20th century, few of them were using the sails. They were just using them for cargo handling. Yes.
There's a lighthouse at the end of the bridge. Are there other lighthouses, and why weren't they effective at helping ships know where they were?
Yes, there are a number of lighthouses. They were not there in the early years, of course, and many people, petitioned the government and said, "We need lighthouses here. This is a dangerous coast." Point Reyes was one of the first. Point Bonita was very early. Fort Point, Alcatraz. So there were many lighthouses. You can't see them in the fog. And when they first built the Point Reyes lighthouse, they said, put it as high as you can so you can see it way out to sea. And of course, You couldn't see it because it was above the fog. And when the Haddingtonshire came ashore, the light was on. They went, right past it, just a mile or so away. The second officer said that he thought he saw a light flash somewhere up there in the fog, but it was too late. And so they moved the Point Reyes lighthouse down to its current location, so it's usually under the fog now. But yeah, the Point Bonito light is a very important light. It's how you find the Golden Gate. People always wonder about the Golden Gate, like, Drake sailed by it, Cermeño, Vizcaíno, Cabrillo, they all sailed right past the Golden Gate, not one saw it. How can you miss something as big as the Golden Gate? Well, there didn't used to be a bridge there. And people had discovered the Farallones very early on, an extremely dangerous set of islands out there, very hard to see, very small. And so they steered clear of them. They would go a couple of miles outside the Farallon Islands, which puts them 30 miles offshore. And if you're even 6 or 8 miles offshore and you look back in and Photoshop out the Golden Gate Bridge, the Berkeley Hills are at the same height as the coastal hills. It just is a steady line of hills. It's not at all obvious, even from 5 miles offshore. And from 20 or 30 miles out, it wouldn't have been visible at all. So, once it became a port and everybody was heading for it, they would always be arriving in the fog. And so the lighthouse on Point Bonito was really a lifesaver. There are many, many wrecks on the point, however, on Bonito Point, dozens. It didn't save everybody. And some of these wrecks said, if we had heard a foghorn, we would have been saved. People were suing, and they said, you weren't running the foghorn. It was a steam-powered foghorn. They ran out of water one time. And people were saying, you could have brought a few barrels of water from Sausalito and kept that thing going. The lighthouses made a huge difference. Radio made a huge difference, to be able to tell people you were in trouble and tell them where you were. But it didn't help the Hanalei. Just no one could figure out how to rescue them. Now you'd use the helicopter, of course, but then they had no options. Yes, sir.
In your research, what about foghorns? I don't know about them. They used more on the East Coast, or they an innovation of San Francisco Bay? When did they come online? And what?
The question was, when were foghorns established? And I don't know the answer. They were certainly by the middle of the 19th century, I would say, there were foghorns. Some of them are like hand-pumped foghorns. I had one on the ship. It was that old that, it's a little box. You pumped it about 10 times and then it finally go, it's a funny honk. But you could hear it for a long way. There were also complaints about the foghorn on Point Bonito because it pointed out to sea so that ships could hear it, and ships coming out couldn't. So a number of ships went aground on Point Diablo or on Point Bonito because they couldn't hear the foghorn. As you know, I live in San Anselmo, and even on a beautiful clear day, I often hear the foghorn blasting out there, from East Brother. So that they're very helpful. In my own experience of sailing in the bay is that it's hard to tell what direction they're coming from. When you're in a really thick fog where you can't see your bow, you go, I hear a foghorn somewhere.
Well, isn't the one going into the Golden Gate, one on each shore, they're supposed to have a different tone? Or
Yeah.
beat 3 times, one, that's how you tell?
Yeah, they're diatones, the ones that, boo. And they're different sounds on the North Tower and the South Tower. I know one time I was walking across the bridge considerably under the influence in a thick fog, and was standing there at the North Tower looking over at the railing trying to see the water, and the foghorn went off right behind my head. Interesting. Yes, sir.
Have there been any shipwrecks in the last 10 or 20 years?
Not that I know of. Like I say, I was taking wrecks that hit Marin. There was one that I was nearly an eyewitness to. When I first moved here in '86, I went out I was driving along Highway 1 and stopped at one of those scenic overlooks. And as I was wont to do, I went bushwhacking down through the chaparral to see if I could get to the water, and couldn't. But I could hear foghorns, on the various vessels out there in the fog. And suddenly one of them hit short, repeated blasts over and over, 8, 10 blasts, which is a signal of distress, emergency. And it just registered with me that, I'm glad I'm not on a vessel. And then the next day I heard that a fishing boat had gone missing. And now I can't remember the name of it, but the Lewis, I think it was. And there was a great mystery. It was in the papers, what had happened to it. And the Coast Guard said that on their radar they saw a freighter that had been northbound freighter that had been quite close to their position. They talked to them and they said, "Oh no, we didn't see or hear anything." And they went up to Vancouver and were inspected there, and they found fishing nets wrapped around their prop and damage on their hull. So they quite clearly ran it down, and there were no survivors. They say they didn't even hear it. So that one I know about. The last wrecks in my boat were in 1974. In my book were in 1974, the two barges that went ashore on Point Bonita, one in Point Bonita, one in Rodeo Cove. One was full of beer, and the local residents said, "Great, we'll rescue them." And the other one was full of chlorine gas, and everybody said, "No, you rescue them." So yeah, it was quite. They said if the gas had ruptured, it probably would have affected the whole Bay Area. But they lifted them out carefully with helicopters one at a time. It took days. And frankly, I got tired of reading the newspapers by 1974 and stopped scanning after that. So if anyone knows of any wrecks since then in Marin, I'd be happy to add them. I just gave this talk last week at the Sausalito Yacht Club, and that day I'd been sailing and ran aground on trying to get into San Rafael Canal. And I thought, I'm going to have to write another chapter in the book. Anyone else? Yes?
This may be a really odd question, but you referred to the Golden Gate as early as Drake. Where did the name Golden Gate, do you have any idea?
Yes, Colonel Fremont, when he ripped the state away from Mexico in 1846 during the Bear Flag Revolt, he took San Rafael, killed some Mexican residents here, and then went down and took a boat across to the Presidio to capture San Francisco. Now, understand, there was just a few hundred residents in Yerba Buena, which is over where the mission is, and then this really small Presidio with 4 soldiers to guard the entire coast. And they saw the boats full of crazy Americans coming for them, and they did the sensible thing and beat it. So the Americans went up and spiked the cannon. They drove nails into the touch holes so they couldn't be used, and raised the flag, and we've conquered this. And Fremont was so inspired by the beauty of the Golden Gate that he named it the Golden Gate after the Golden Horn in Constantinople. So yeah, the Golden Gate is the strait, not the bridge. It's the bridge over the Golden Gate.
I have a question.
Yes.
There is what is the remains of a helipad over by Land's End, correct? There was a helicopter that they used for sea rescue there. Is that true?
I don't know about that.
There's one at the VA hospital.
Yeah, right by the VA hospital. And there's some controversy about Francis Drake landing. Did he really land at the beach, over in Point Reyes, or is it actually inside the bay near Strawberry?
There are a number of schools of thought on that, and typical of historians, they're at each other's throats about it and have been for the last 50 years. The Drake Navigators Guild has done a great deal of research, and some more, oddly enough, some more information turned up in the last few decades. The main reason that people thought it might have been in the bay at San Rafael was that they found the plaque of brass on the hill above the ferry terminal in San Rafael. But there are a couple of problems with that. One is it wasn't where Drake had put it. He had mounted it on a post on the beach. And there's no reason to think the Indians couldn't have picked it up and moved it, or someone else could have picked it up and moved it. Second, it wasn't found at that spot originally. It was found at Bolinas, and someone brought it, threw it in his car, didn't know what it was. He was going to use it to repair a hole in the side of his car. Eventually, as he was driving down Highway 1, he tossed it out the window, and that's where it was found. And finally, the whole thing was a fake. So there's no evidence that he was ever in the bay. What surprised me is a navigator like that could go around the world wouldn't mention seeing the Golden Gate and seeing San Francisco Bay. The first people who did see it in 1769 said it's the greatest harbor in the world. All the navies of the world could anchor here. And Drake didn't mention it. And he mentions that where he anchored reminded him very much of Dover because there's these tall white cliffs. And there's nothing like that inside the bay. It's only at Drake's Bay. So the National Park Service has come down and said, we firmly agree that it's Drake's Bay. They put up a monument there. So it's more or less official. But I just saw an article by a guy who said, no, it's Strawberry Point.
And what's the saying over at Point Bonita where they have that chute where the rescue boat goes down? For sure you can go in, but there's no promise that you'll come back.
Yeah, that's still the slogan of the Coast Guard. You have to go out. You don't have to come back.
Come back, right?
Yeah, that was the Point Bonita life-saving station that was involved in many of these wrecks. They launched from there and went to the wreck. And until the motorized boats came along about that time, they rowed. From Fort Point, they would row up to Point Reyes in a storm.
Wow.
At night. So brave men.
Well, one couple more, and then we'll.
Yes, sir.
I was wondering, you have a lot of details, especially on shipwrecks we talked about tonight. Were there any in the course of that stymied by lack of or just that sort of performance?
Yeah, there's many of them. Like I say, I got many of these out of the newspaper, and there'd be an article that says, unnamed schooner went aground in Balenas, and that's all I ever found. And there's a lot of those. There's probably 30 of them. People say they, capsized and rescued, or people picked up after a capsize, and there's just not enough detail. There was no follow-up article, so I know nothing more about them. I just basically listed them in the book. What I did to make the book a little easier to read is I selected the ones that more major wrecks and put them in the front. And so you can read through those and not get the boring ones, and then put all the smaller ones later in the book so that if you're really a history nut and just like reading this stuff, you can do it. The book's for sale here for $20. I'd be happy to sign it for you.
Okay.
And there was another question?
No.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, when the National Seashore was founded, the National Park Service hired a marine archaeology consortium to go make a study of what might be in the water out here. And it's online called Submerged Cultural Resources. It's a fascinating thing. I got a lot of the material for my book from that. And they went around Drake's Bay with a magnetometer, which will detect metal underwater, iron underwater. And the San Augustine had many cannon, so you would think it would show up. Their problem was they found too many wrecks. They found several dozen magnetic anomalies there, and they don't know which one it is. And as far as I know, no one's ever gotten permission to actually do an excavation there. It'd be a tricky excavation, right? It's right in the surf. But it hasn't been found. Like I say, a lot of porcelain has been found. Some artifacts have been found. A British shilling was found, 16th century shilling, which almost certainly came from Drake's Bay.
Okay.
One of my wrecks is two boats collided off Angel Island, and one of them capsized. And people were rescued off it, and it drifted out to sea. And it had a safe in it that had 2 bars of gold bullion in it. And of course, all the tugboats said, I'll get them, I'll go get those guys, and they went out and got the thing and brought it back, and they found this great big hole in the top of the cabin where the safe had fallen out of it. So that's somewhere off Point Blunt there at the south end of Angel Island. So if anyone has their scuba gear with them, there's $2 million in gold down there.
Okay, well, I think that's a good, hopeful. I have a question for you before we close. How many have been into San Francisco and seen those medallions in the sidewalk, the Barbary Coast tour?
Yeah.
Okay, and followed. Have you taken the Barbary Coast walk around? Well, first Wednesday, that's August 7th, we have the author of that walk. And his name is Daniel Bacon, and he'll be here to talk about the Barbary Coast walk in town. I've done it in San Francisco in 8 hours. I got half of it done, and it's fabulous. So I hope you'll come next month. And thank you so much, Brian, for a most riveting evening. Thank you all, and thanks for helping us put the room together.